welcome you all to the very first Just an Hour session for the spring semester. As many of you know, we had a very successful series in the fall, and Punya and I and Clarin are excited to start these up again for the spring. Punya is out of town, otherwise he would be here with us. So I and Clarin will be facilitating the session today. And as you know, the topic is life after tenure / the doctorate. What are we working towards or for? So before we get into the session, we usually like to start with just a few things about the sessions and then any announcements of things that are coming up that we want to make sure that you're aware of. So as I think you all know, the Just an Hour series was started to be a relatively informal opportunity in just an hour for us to engage with different ideas, different topics each week that are relevant to our lives as academics. And the sessions are open to everyone from doc students on through tenured faculty. So we invite everyone to come and we encourage your participation. So one of the things we ask you to do is feel free to use the chat for ideas that come up or questions. We like to allow time during the discussion for everyone who's here to be able to chime in, but do feel free to post in the chat as we're going. A couple things about Just an Hour. We've planned just about all the sessions for the spring already, and we're using a different invitation format. You'll be getting separate calendar invitations for each one. That helps us keep a little better track of who's signed up to come and gives us a little more opportunity to advertise in advance the topic of each session. So you should have received invitations for the January 20th and January 27th sessions already. And I just want to give a shout out to Clarin, who has been working overtime in helping us confirm all the participants and, excuse me, and in getting these scheduled. So thank you so much, Clarin. And I think that's it. Clarin, do you have any other announcements before we start that you'd like to add? Nope. Okay, so the topic for today's session actually was inspired by a question last semester from one of our early career faculty members in regard specifically to life after tenure. And I'm not sure if he or she was at a particularly frustrating point in the semester or what prompted the question in particular, but we thought it was a really good one for us to think about, irregardless of career stage. We have a number of significant milestones as academics, ranging first from simply earning the doctorate, not simply from earning the doctorate, on through getting tenure, and even on through getting promoted to full professor. So I think it's something that, it's a question that most of us have probably asked ourselves at some point, particularly when we've reached a milestone and can kind of step back and say, okay, I'm here, kind of now what? So we've asked a group of faculty of 4 folks who are at different career stages to join us as discussants to talk a little bit about their personal experiences. They're in quite different positions and at least as far as we know, are doing some different things to, for example, balance career and other aspects of their lives, and otherwise, kind of create what we hope are satisfying and productive career trajectories. So we have 4, you've seen the list in the invitation, and what we're going to do is start, we have a loose set of questions as we do for most of these sessions. So we're going to start with a few questions that we have prepared for them to respond to. But again, feel free to post other questions and comments in the chat, and we'll certainly shift to addressing some of the topics that you may want to talk about, depending on how far we get with our question list. So what I'd like to do is to start by asking each of our discussants to briefly introduce themselves. Just mention your current career stage so everyone knows where you are in that kind of academic career trajectory. and say a little bit about your scholarly interests, and then we'll dive into some of the more meatier questions. So, Stefan, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you so much. Hi, folks. My name is Stefan Santa-Ramirez. I go by he, him pronouns. I'm currently in my third year as an assistant professor of higher education in the Ed Leadership and Policy program at the University at Buffalo in Western New York. And my agenda looks broadly on the historical, ideological, and structural inequities that impact Black, Latinx, migrant, and other marginalized communities, more particularly in college settings. Particularly, I investigate campus racial climates, student activism and resistance efforts, and the various ways that race, ethnicity, immigration status, and policy inform the educational experiences of those who are racially minoritized and identify as undocumented.
Very cool. Thank you. And
Thank you.
I'm excited to be able to meet you for the first
Same
time.
here.
So
Same
welcome.
here. And I graduated from ASU's ELP at Leadership and Policy. Excuse me, that's the department I work in. EPE, Educational Policy and Evaluation Program in 2020.
How quickly they forget.
All of these acronyms.
So thinking of that focus, maybe I'll ask David Garcia to follow up with a brief introduction.
Sure. Thank you, everybody. Stefan, I can't believe it's been 3 years. That's unbelievable. Feels like you were just in our department running around Mary Lou Fulton Farmers Building yesterday. Everyone, I'm David Garcia. I see a lot of familiar faces on here. My research interest, what got me to kind of got a pre-tenure, post-tenure research interest. What got me to tenure was looking at school choice, charter schools with an emphasis in large-scale quantitative data. So I did quite a bit of work, still right in school choice and on charter school issues, as well as accountability policies as well. Post-tenure, however, I have began to write and have finished a book in research utilization. So taking on the question, who is using our research or not? And a area that really has been on my mind for a number of years, but really came to the fore for me after receiving tenure and after a stint in politics. So that's what I do academically. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. Geez, and I really want to know who actually uses our research. That may or may not be motivating, depending on what you found. So Dr. Serafini, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Frank Serafini. I'm a professor of literacy education and children's literature, and I've kind of used that dual moniker for a long time. I got my master's in elementary education here at ASU, graduated in '92, so I've been here on campus for a long time, and then did my doctorate here as well. My early work was really in literacy pedagogy. I wrote a lot of books for Heinemann around reading workshop and doing a lot of stuff in student-centered reading pedagogy was really where I started, but there was always the focus on picture books, and that has kind of been a bridge to my current work in multimodality and multimodal research practices. And I've written some books on multimodal research approaches and things like that. And so I'm still dabbling in picture books. I was at the University of South Australia last summer as the MEM-Fox invited visiting scholar in picture book research. And so I got to kind of go back and work with some of that work again, but bringing a different theoretical lens to it. And so that's kind of where a lot of my current work is going, and alongside other passions, of course. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Frank. Really cool. And everyone, of course, is familiar with your photography. So that's something that may come up too. So
I did have an article published for the first time this year in a photography magazine. So that was really kind of interesting, doing something different. I wrote a piece about photographing ancient ancestral Puebloan ruins. And it was fun to kind of play in writing in a very, very different genre. So that was kind of fun.
Very cool. So Nicole, a brief introduction?
Sure. So I'm Nicole Thompson, and I serve as the Vice Dean for Teacher Preparation. I am a professor now in elementary education, really. Here, when I took this position 6-ish years ago, I think, I came in as an associate professor in a different role. And so I've earned promotion since being here. It's my third institution. All of my degrees are in elementary education. I had no desire to be in leadership, and ironically find myself here because I kept asking questions, but that's a bit of a different story. And happy to be here and talk with you guys today.
Thanks, Nicole. And I guess I'm writing down tips for people. And one thing might be don't start asking questions. I don't want to be a leader.
They make for very windy journeys.
Not sure if that was my problem, but here we are. So let's kick off a discussion of career trajectories. And a few of you have already mentioned some of this in your introductions, but the first question we had was really asking each of you to tell us a little bit about what we'd call your academic journey. So, I know in retrospect, these journeys kind of can seem very logical and rational, et cetera. But in reality, we usually have to make different choices, potentially explore alternatives. So, our question is, what choices did you make or alternatives did you explore in pursuing the academic journey, the path you're on? And maybe I'll go back to Stefan to start us off.
Sure. So I would, not to give the full story because we don't have that much time. I started out in the corporate sector working for an insurance company. Realized that my passions lied elsewhere after a few years, ended up transitioning into a master's program in Michigan in student affairs administration, higher education, which led me to a career as a higher ed administrator working in diversity, LGBT plus affairs, and migrant student services at different institutions across the country. When I was interested in pursuing a doctorate and had this idea of becoming a faculty member, I was attracted to various programs, which led me to ASU's Ed Policy and Evaluation program. And I wanted to engage more in policy work and policy analysis work to complement kind of my student affairs administration, higher education master's degree. And when I was in my doctoral program, because I had a higher education administrator background, professional background, it was always in the back of my head that I can do either or. I can probably go back and be like on a senior leadership team somewhere at some institution across the country, but also like training myself to be successful on the faculty market, as I really wanted to engage in research and I think have a little more autonomy in my schedule as a faculty member versus as an administrator, which traditionally works like 9 to 5. But in student affairs, it's not really 9 to 5 because there's like a lot of evening programs and events that you always have to go to, and in some cases weekends as well. So I applied for faculty positions my last year in the doc program, and I was offered a position that I accepted the semester before I graduated. So the fall semester before I graduated in May. And that's where I am now.
Great, thanks. I'm kind of making little notes to myself to see if there's themes that arise, but I appreciated your point about having autonomy, at least in comparison to being a more traditional administrator. I think that's one of the things maybe we sometimes forget we have and don't appreciate quite so much.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
I'm going to mix it up a bit and ask Frank to jump in, if you would, to tell us a little bit about your trajectory.
Yeah, I think you're right. We kind of put it up on a PowerPoint slide as if it's a progressive plot diagram that has a focus and a direction, but it looks more like a Gordian knot when you really look back at it. I was a guitar player looking for a day job, is really where it started. And I had spent 3 years as a touring musician, and one of the guys in the band I was playing with asked me if I wanted to be a substitute teacher. And I went down and substitute taught down at Garcia Elementary in the Murphy district. And the first day I was in PE, and that I did not like that. And then I did 4th grade for a couple days. And on Friday, after my first week of being a sub, I drove to ASU and signed up for the elementary program. And it was really quite life-changing at the time. I remember calling my mother and telling her I had a new idea. She, paused quite long, for quite a while, because she had heard that before. And I started, I think along any journey, there's, if you go back to Fry's archetypes, there's always the sidekick. So I had a lot of sidekicks at the time, but there's always sort of a guru, the helper along the way. And it was Lynn Searfoss, who was one of my master's professors here at ASU, who kind of believed in me and said that he told me I should get a PhD and that he would be my advisor. And no one had ever really done that for me in education. A lot of other places, I had a lot of good mentors and a lot of things, but he said that. And at the time, I didn't think I could do it. I didn't think I had the writing skills or the thinking skills, but he was great. And so I, finishing up at ASU, I went to UNLV for 7 years, where I met Leanna. She's on here. We were up there together for a bit, and it was an interesting time. I think I had one of the cushier assistant professor jobs that I've heard of in a long time, because I was the only assistant professor in literacy education. And at the time at UNLV, there were some real leaders in the field there. We had John Reedenson, Tom Bean, and Marilyn McKinney, Marla Mallette, I know I'm forgetting a few, Diane Barone, and so and Cindy Georges, of course, who's here. And they took amazing care of me. And I was like their kid, and they didn't let me do too much service, and they supported me and got me on grants. And I mean, they were, compared to what some people's experiences like as an assistant professor, mine was really supportive. And it was a great, and I wasn't destined to stay at UNLV, but it was a great 7 years there. And I came out with a lot of pubs and a lot of experiences, and that was really helpful. Then I came back here when it wasn't Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College. It was we were at West Campus. I was a professor without a doctoral program when we were at West, when Mary Kerner hired me, long before the great disruption, whatever we're calling it, upheaval. And I know for me it was a bonus, because I got to start working with more colleagues and doc students. But at the time, there were a lot of impassioned, disappointed people that Mary Kerner became the dean. So that part of it was quite eye-opening to see it from other people who I knew, because I had been a doc student, from their perspectives, what it was like to be taken over, right? Now I'm a full professor. I went through, it's been 7-8 years now, I guess, since I got promoted. And I think I have more freedom to study the things that I want to study, though I've always felt like I've had that freedom. I think people say, when I get full, I'll do whatever I want. Yeah, if you don't do whatever you want as an assistant, you won't do whatever you want as a full. I don't think that it gives you any more room to move if you don't take it. But I do have some wonderful things that I'm writing on, and had crazy. I don't need to publish anymore. And yet I published more this year than the last 10 years, I think, just kind of one of those things where things came together. And I think one of the trajectory things that gets weird when you get older, you get asked to do more interesting things than I used to. And so I'm writing handbook chapters and encyclopedia chapters, and those kind of things that's been an interesting part of this last stage of the journey, getting to write more international and different kinds of work rather than just single research pieces. So I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Frank. That really interesting. Thinking too about how the context shifts, and that can push you in a different direction, like with the reorganization or other kinds of things. So that I think is important. David, I saw you nodding when Frank said, well, if you're not writing about what interests you as an assistant professor, you're not going to do it. And that makes me think maybe will I ask you to go next and talk a little bit about your experience?
Well, what Frank had said there, was I'm going to wait till I get to be full professor and then go do what I want to do. And that's something I hear that advice given to graduate students. Pardon me, to early career professors all the time, which is get your head down, go get tenure. And after you get tenure, then you can go do what you want to do. And I think it's kind of a sad commentary, that you're going to sit down and do something you don't want to do for 6 years until you get to the position where you can. Although I do, agree with Frank. I think that there are folks who take some risks and they're going to take them throughout their entire career. And it's not as if you're going to wake up one day, feel secure, and then start taking risks, right? I think that those two things go hand in hand. And some of the folks when I was at ASU first starting out that I sat down with, some of the later career professors that I sat with were those that I had felt had an adventurous academic career, and the ones that I kind of wanted to emulate. Because for me personally, I come to Arizona State, I come to ASU after having spent time in policy. So I was the state superintendent, Arizona Associate State Superintendent for Arizona for a little while. I also worked at the state legislature as the Senate Education Analyst. Those were formative experiences for me because, Betty, to answer your question, I was a grad student at the time, and the people I was reading during at night to finish my dissertation were not the people that the legislature was using to cite, as resources. We had a test, assessment in Arizona that was really in upheaval. It was really problematic. And we had great psychometricians running around ASU and ASU West, and they weren't there helping for a number of reasons. They weren't being asked to help, right? And so those experiences have always stuck with me. But I started at ASU. I did put my head down and start writing, but I also maintained a public profile. I continued to do community events, continued to consult, continue to work with the governor's office, State Department of Education, other states in consulting capacities around accountability and assessment policies. So I maintained a really public profile, continued to be available to the media. That was something else that I had a skill set that I had picked up prior to going to ASU, and I continued to do. So when I got tenure, I remember sitting down with my wife. I'm like, all right, I got a couple different directions I can go. I can keep going down the academic route because I had been pretty involved in AERA, and I felt like I was getting groomed to go down a vice president route at AERA, and it would have been wonderful. And Nicole probably would have ended up in some leadership position because I kind of felt like that was in my bones. Or I can run for office, and that latter one was a big shift for me. And I thought about running for office because I come to realize that, folks, if we're going to change policy, we got to go through politics. And I hate to say it, but we do. And I felt like we needed people who understood education. I was getting tired of running analyses and taking them up to legislators who either didn't want to or couldn't pay attention to them. And said, I got enough background. I can do this. And so in 2014, a couple of years after getting tenure, I ran for state superintendent. Never run for anything before. And in that year, a down ballot, really a tough year for Democrats. I got within 0.5% of winning that year, and that was a big deal because politically, when I walked in the door and said, "Hey, I'm going to run for state office," and they looked at me and said, "Let me get this straight. You are a Latino Democrat running for a state office. Good luck with that. But we had a strategy, and we did get that close. So between 2014 and 2018, for those of you listening in your own career trajectories, was not the most productive time for me as an academic, because I knew I was going to run again, right? I couldn't commit to anything long term. I knew about 2016 I was going to start cranking up another campaign, because the question really wasn't, what I was, if I was going to run, it was what I was going to run for, because we had done so well in 2014. So come 2018, sitting down, reading the room, trying to understand things politically, and decided I'd run for governor in 2018. And it's that experience that has really led to my research utilization scholarship, because my run in 2014 was very different from a content perspective than my run in 2018. In 2014, I was perfectly comfortable with everything anybody would throw at me, because it was all education. But in 2018, suddenly I had to go comment on transportation and health and forestry and areas in which that was not my initial, that was not my background. And I came to realize that I was a lot like the politicians that I had seen when I was at the legislature. Those folks weren't in education. They were business people. They were insurance salesmen. They were farmers. They were ranchers. They were whatever they were. And they were taking whatever skill set they had to try to understand education. And that's why, a lot of times when I hear my colleagues writing and bemoaning a lot of our market-based approach to education, I look at the people who are making decisions, and they're all business folks. And how can you, if you're a business folk, that's your background, you're going to look at the world from markets. And if you're in the education committee, you're probably going to implement markets. And so, a market-based approach. And so that has led to the book I finished, Teach Truth to Power, which really is the intersection between research, policy, and politics. And that last part, the politics part, is I think the unique contribution, because I argue in the book that politicians ultimately were novices. And in health and in transportation and in these other areas outside of education, I was a novice. It wasn't as I wasn't smart, like I didn't have not like I wasn't educated. I didn't know anything about health. And I needed to be communicated to really quickly to get in front of big groups of people and talk enough about health to get by. And that's exactly where a lot of our politicians are in education. And that's kind of the thrust of my current scholarship right now.
Fascinating, David. Wow. Both, in terms of like risk taking and just thinking about the value of like stepping out of academics for a little while to get a different perspective. Doesn't have to be politics. It could be some other area. And, if there's ways that we could support faculty in doing that, I think it just sounds so generative, at least in terms of your experience. So
yeah, it really was. It was the piece that brought together for me finishing the book. It's still what I continue to write on. I do trainings, for example, just in Florida with faculty or research organizations, helping them understand. But from a career perspective, really hard to get back and cranking again, because as you know, when you're doing really well, you got something you're writing on, something you're thinking about, something you're finishing. Disrupting that cycle was a challenge, and getting that cranked up again has been an effort, because if you step too far away, obviously you're going to disrupt that productivity.
mm-hmm. Good point. Yeah. Okay, Nicole. So I get the impression that your route into administration or leadership wasn't completely intentional, but let's enjoy hearing your story too. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
So after completing my PhD at the University of Georgia, I had a job opportunity at Mississippi State, which was my first institution. I had applied for a position, and we were discussing it, and they came back and said, that'd be great, but we have this other thing we want to talk to you about, because we have gotten this endowment, not an endowment, an earmark from one of the senators to develop a early childhood research initiative, and we need an emphasis on American Indian early childhood education. And we don't know that much about American Indian education, but we know enough to know we're going to need an American Indian to lead this work. So what if we create a position that allows for you to lead this as half your job, and then the other half you will develop a middle school program, because I actually was one course shy of my PhD in middle level education from Georgia. The faculty member refused to do an independent study to make that happen. So my degree ended up in elementary ed. So I have a strong middle school background. I was like, oh my gosh, that'd be amazing. I could work in both areas of my passion. I can figure out how to give back to my community. I can build middle level ed. This was something new at the time in Mississippi. They had just passed laws about having specific focus areas and teacher preparation around middle school education. So I could build something. And I took that position. Didn't know what it meant to be joint appointed, to have two 50%, but really 100% jobs, and what that was going to mean to build something from the ground up in both spaces. But that's what I did. And my first years as an assistant professor were hard, because I reported to two separate entities, two separate reviews, two separate sets of expectations, and nobody understood, how those came together. And so I did a lot of work, and I learned how to do a lot of program building and how to ask a lot of questions, how to collaborate and make partners, and seek help, seek information, and find ways to move forward. It was complicated. I would not encourage somebody right out of grad school to take that position and engage in that activity. I think I didn't know what I didn't know, so I just went in and put plans together and figured it out, and made some really good friends along the way, and had some really strong mentorship helping me understand the role of the professorate, how to be successful, how am I managing, all of my advising load and my teaching load and my doc students, and doing this program work and traveling to all these American Indian communities and trying to understand what their early childhood needs are, and knowing that in that American Indian space, at the time, the statistic was 0.25% of PhDs are American Indian. Like, there's nobody for these people to go to when they're looking at the early care and education of their children for support and understanding around teacher development and capacity and support. So it was a lot. And, I don't know that I intentionally made the choice to have that really practical application of my work, but that's how it's been over my career. It's been a very practical focus. From that position, I knew I just wanted to always be with the people who were making things happen for kids and communities. And so I did stay very close to the classroom and with partners who were in that space. My husband's job actually moved us from Mississippi State to the University of Memphis. And so I had gotten promoted and tenured at Mississippi State, and then he took a different position. I commuted for a year. And I had two children at the time. It was hard. It was 222 miles door to door from my house, almost in Tennessee, to the Mississippi State campus in Starkville. And I ended up taking a position at the University of Memphis that took me back to an assistant professor role, because it took me where my family was. So I made some personal choices that impacted my journey as well. I got 2 years of credit for all of my work and started over, basically, and was again promoted at University of Memphis. And in there, they were so excited because I came with all this program building and other types of experience that they were trying to think about how to advance their teacher preparation and build in more partnership space. And I said, I'm not doing that again. I'm going to teach my 4 classes, and I am going to go home every day. I am going to write, and it is going to be great. And that didn't happen. There were early opportunities. They were trying to change things. I had big questions, like stemming back to my own pre-service days, figuring out why it was so hard. there was something I clearly thought I missed in my undergraduate preparation that still wasn't right for people who were going through their undergraduate preparation. Teaching didn't feel like it should have to be that hard. And so I started asking questions, seeking other partners, looking at what other universities were doing, bringing ideas back to the leadership team at in my department and to the dean, the then dean there, and said, why don't we try something different? And he was like, well, why don't you lead that? And I guess when you bring the idea and a potential solution, you can't say no when you're given the opportunity to enact it. And so that really pushed me into more of the formal leadership space. I was probably academically risky being an early associate professor and stepping out of some of the traditional academic space to make time for leadership space and to figure that out and to spend more time in administration and for some of that political engagement within the university structure. But it worked. I don't know, I created a path, and our program grew, our program changed. Not everybody liked it. It's not when you go into an administrative position where the idea is that you're going to bring about change, you are not going to make people happy. And I think that was one of the biggest, not challenges, but something I really had to accept, that if I wanted to do work that was practical, thinking about the kids in the classroom, communities and folks who needed support, then I had to make the decision to continue to push forward with ideas and trying to bring people on board and talk and think differently about how we were doing teacher preparation, that people weren't going to be always happy with that. And that was okay. It was in all of that space that I ended up meeting Carol inadvertently, like through another contact, which she was in her first year here. What she was talking about were similar things that I was trying to talk about with people at the University of Memphis, and we had conversations, and it was just like, this is perfect. And so here we are, and thinking differently, pushing forward, and trying to figure out what's next for preparation, which circles back to my very first pre-service days when I was thinking I'm missing something because it doesn't make sense, and we're getting closer to making some sense.
Thanks so much, Nicole. I'm just enjoying so much hearing more about my colleague's background, but it's interesting to me how you did really have a driving sort of passion or interest, despite what might look like a moves from different position to different position. And I'm hoping you're in a place now where you feel like you can realize that, but that might be a topic for another conversation.
Yeah, it's really interesting when what you think you're going to do, and then what you end up doing, like reflecting back on your path, it's different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we do have another question, although I just wanted to pause and see if anyone else wanted to jump in with a question or, topic for our panelists before we move to our next one.
I got one. I'm kind of curious. Nicole and Frank and I are in a different position or a different point in our careers than Stefan. So 3 years in, Stefan, where do you see yourself going from here? I'm curious.
Well, I do have the goal of tenure.
Okay.
So I'm in my 3rd year review now, currently, and my department chair was actually asking me, like, do you have aspirations to be a department chair at some point? And I'm like, maybe, but today let's talk about tenure and one step at a time. Do I see myself advancing in administration? Yes, I think because I've been an administrator and because a lot of my work is in close proximity to administration and working with student affairs administrators, at least, and policymakers at the campus level, I can see myself naturally gravitating towards that. But right now, I think I do want to meet the goal of associate and then full faculty, and I am most likely going up early for tenure, and I've gotten the support of my dean and my department chair thus far. So those are the goals right now. You know, I always say you are in the position that you're supposed to be in, and the location that you're supposed to be in, the time of your life. So whatever happens, I would embrace the journey when it's presented and see what happens and see what feels good for me and my family at that point in my life.
Thanks for sharing, Stefan. And I feel like because you are the earliest on in your career, when part of it's hard because you had to go first, but I feel like you were so nonchalant about, yeah, I applied to the job, I got the job, it was offered. Whereas I feel like, especially for most of our doctoral students graduating, I mean, the market is so tough. So obviously, and as he just mentioned, he's probably going up early. That speaks to you, Stefan, too. So what you've done. So just wanted to emphasize your work and what you contribute.
I appreciate that, Corinne. Thank you.
Sure. So we had a couple other questions, and I know just because of time, we probably won't get to them all. So I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to raise this question to everyone and have you add it in the chat because I think it'll be valuable. What advice would you give? I think it might be easier to think about somebody as an assistant professor starting out, but if you have a specific recommendation or advice for people in your particular point in your career, you know, basically any advice, but if it's easier to think about early career starting out, what advice would you give? And besides the panelists, I'd love to hear what other advice everybody in this session has. So if you'll add that to the chat, and then to go back to the panel, I'm going to kind of combine two questions and you can answer them how you want. But we had one question that was basically like, what keeps you going, what motivates you or gets you up in the morning? So yes, I'd like you to talk to that, but also whether or not the pandemic changed that. So thinking about like what motivates you, what drives you in your work, and whether or not that was changed by the pandemic. And I'm going to kind of reverse this order. So Nicole, let's start with you on that question.
Meaningful and rewarding work. I think it's trying to figure out how to serve students and communities and how to make, I don't know if this is going to sound right or not, but like education work for everybody, right? Like there are communities and kids and places where it's not working and it needs to be. So how do we think about teacher preparation and the pathways and the experiences we're providing in our programming to bridge that? That's my meaningful, rewarding piece. And my research agenda has shifted significantly over time to help with the career changes. But there's always been that thread of engagement and community support and looking at what we do and how we do it. That's what gets me up. That's what makes each day worthwhile, and thinking about this administrative piece and focusing on, you know, supporting faculty and students and thinking about how we continue to grow is all built into that. That's why I accepted the first opportunities to move into leadership, never thinking I wanted to, but for that. And then I think that the pandemic just made it easier to do more work. In the sense that I didn't have drive time anymore. So I can start earlier and work longer and figure that out. So it's been a little harder coming back from that and then thinking about how do we streamline effort and energy and what are the things we need to tackle right now? And then what are the things that come next and how do we bridge that? Because we're building for today, but thinking about what kids are going to be doing 10 years from now with what we're doing today, and how do we prepare them for that? And how do we think about what the field's going to look like? And how do we prepare teachers to be most effective in that space? And what are the other supports? So working in a now and building for a future is an interesting thing. I think that the pandemic has shown us that we need a lot more thinking about the future, especially for different kids and their communities.
Thank you. I feel like some of these questions of like what gets you up and then how you ended that with all those additional questions is probably what keeps you up. So you could answer that either way.
Lots of coffee.
Yeah, seriously.
Many cups of ambition.
All right, Frank, let's go to you.
The last 3 days, what's gotten me up is filling out my annual review form and the crazy ass program involved with this thing that is anything but innovative. We'll just stop there. That's just been the last few days, you know. getting up in the morning is better than the alternative, right? Obviously, so I'll try to keep getting up in the morning. What's really been interesting to me is you know, as I'm older than I was, I get up when I used to get home. Right? And I really do. I mean, being a bartender and a guitar player, I used to get home at 2 and 3, and now I get up at 4 and 5. And so it's been very, I never felt natural being a late night person. And I didn't really know at the time that it just was hard for me to stay up late at night. And even as a kid, I didn't do it. My cousins were up till 4 in the morning, and then they slept till noon. I never felt, I couldn't do it. If I stayed up real late, I didn't get much sleep. And now I get up at 5 o'clock and I write and I do stuff, and it feels better. But what gets me up in the morning right now is sort of trying to swim against the tide of some of the work in literacy these days. I think we're really, you know, everyone talks about pendulums. I think that's a bunch of crap. Stuff comes and goes, you know. But we're seeing, and David spoke very eloquently about this notion of what politicians know and don't know, and what politicians buy into, and what politicians do for different reasons. And I know, you know, Steve is talking about the differences between being an undocumented college student and all the work in race, gender, ethnicity is as important, but also we got everybody is missing the boat on what it means to be a literate human being in my book. I just listened to Jim's podcast, Betty, that he did with Lindsay Person, and I had the joy of doing one with her a while back. And he talks eloquently about economic signaling and all this stuff. And I think it's true. I mean, school has become a place where mediocre kids do well because they're going to become dutiful little unquestioning taxpayers. And I just can't think that some of these reading programs aren't perfectly aligned with that sort of model. We don't want you to question what you're reading. We want you just to decode the hell out of it and answer the questions. And so my work trying to come back, I didn't do well coming at it from reading. You know, the whole language kind of came and went, and some of the progressive movements have taken a real beating. But I've come at it now from the arts and from visual literacy back into reading, and I'm finding much more acceptance that making sense of an image isn't as simple as decoding a text either. And so trying to find ways back in, we make sense of the world in many, many different ways: embodied, kinetic, visual, auditory, gestural, all these things. And yet school has basically narrowed it down to one: language. And I think that's really a challenge. And so how do I've had more success outside the United States because our curriculum is incredibly outdated compared to Canada, England, Australia, New Zealand, and it's in terms of multimodality and this other work. And so it's unfortunate that I have to fly a long ways away to talk about this with people, but there's no one at the State Department wants to hear about multimodality and visual literacy here in Arizona right now, that's for sure. And so it's interesting what I'm still beating the same horn. It's a different horn, you know, that reading is more than just making sense of text. And that gets me up in the morning, trying to figure out how to keep telling people this in different platforms, I guess. So that gets me up. And every now and then a cup of coffee, of course, gets me up.
Thank you, Frank. How about you, David?
Frank, not just a cup of coffee, I'd imagine a glass of wine too, if I know you well.
Never before 11 a.m., David, never.
Yeah. You know, to your point, Frank, a couple things. The people at the Department of Education aren't the ones that are going to make the change. It's the people at the top of the Department of Education, and that's a politician. I mean, you can go to the people who work there. They're never going to move faster than the politician. And in the book I write, I do talk about the various ways of knowing for politicians, and I take, and not expressly in your view of the world, but a multimodal approach. There's lots of different ways that politicians come to know, and visuals, for example, are an important, really important way that they're also learning. And I believe we should do more visuals in how we communicate with politicians, because they're effective. So I think there's a tie there to your work. For me personally, I love being a professor. I've wanted to be a professor ever since I was an undergraduate, and I met a professor and realized what he did every day. And I went into his office. He was thinking about something different. He was doing something different. And I asked him, I'm personally a first generation college student. So, I first went to college thinking I had to go get like a real job and get paid like a salary thing. And then I found out this professor gig was fantastic. He got up, he wrote what he wanted to, it felt like he thought about what he wanted to, and people actually paid him to do this. I'm like, I'm in. So I've wanted to be a professor since I was an undergrad. And then I had yesterday is one of those celebratory days for me. I was since I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, Philip Jackson, an education philosopher, was one of my instructors, and he would ride in on a bike, and right outside the building there, he'd park his bike, never locked it up, just parked his bike there, walked in, led an amazing class, and then rode his bike home again. And I'm like, that's what I want to do. And so for me, yesterday, I rode my bike to campus. I gave a class, hopefully half as good as Dr. Jackson did, and rode back home again. And, that makes me happy. It gets me up every day. Now, what you may not appreciate, yes, I did lock my bike up, Claren, good call, because I've had them stolen before at ASU. The thing is, when I was running for office, it's busy and it's crazy and lots going on and wonderful to meet people, and doing stuff at night and meeting people was awesome. What people don't appreciate is you spend about 25 hours on the phone making the exact same fundraising call over and over and over and over and over again. And that was absolutely mind-numbing for me. I hated it. I hated it. And I fought it. And I think nobody likes it, but I really didn't like it. And it was when I was running for office, when I actually had to show up to an office, and I actually had things I needed to do every day, and I couldn't go do what I wanted to do intellectually. I have to admit, somewhere along the way, I thought to myself, why am I doing this? Like, why am I running here? Because I'm not gonna be able to do that professor gig anymore. I knew I had obviously a higher purpose or goal for it, but that kind of repetition drove me nuts. And so to not have two jobs, not running for office and being an academic, and being able to do what I wanted to do to start with, get up and think about what I want to and write, maybe do some analysis today, maybe go experience something, talk to somebody I think is interesting. I personally can't think of a better quality of life, at least for me personally, than to have the privilege of being able to do that for a career.
Thank you. Inspiring. Stefan, how about you? Starting out, what gets you up besides
Sure.
tenure?
Right. I think branching off of something that David mentioned earlier, of sometimes early career faculty, doctoral students are often told, like, do something safe in your work and your research agenda, and then after tenure, right? And that's, again, the tenure system. I think it needs to be abolished, but whatever. that's not this 1 hour session. But that's assuming that folks will get tenure, right? Black and brown people have historically not gotten tenure, in various ways. So anyway, I was told that as a doc student before. No one from ASU told me that. But I remember that person sharing that kind of tidbit with me, or what they thought was a best practice. And I immediately lost respect for this person. And they said, I would never give advice to someone to change your trajectory or change like your passions for the sake of being liked by some. I don't know, but what keeps me up and what keeps me here and still happy as an assistant professor, pre-tenure assistant professor, is that I do get to choose what my agenda is, and I get to still do activism work. Even as a faculty member, I identify as a scholar activist. I used to be a student activist. And I think I'm in a privileged and blessed position in that my senior leadership team doesn't challenge that type of scholar that I am, right? And in fact, they support it. And I think that's what excites me about the job. Thus far, it's not rainbows and unicorns, right? We do work a lot, although there is a lot of autonomy. Obviously, we all know that there is a lot of work that goes into it, which includes early mornings, late at nights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the pressures, if you're at, different institutional types. I'm at a research intensive university, just like an ASU, and that has added layers of different pressures that are put onto faculty members. So it's not all rainbows and unicorns. However, I do love the fact that I can continue to like be intellectually stimulated and be around folk doing good work as a scholar that's also an activist, and can basically do what I want, and that excites me, and that's why I'm still doing it, I think. Right.
Thank you. Betty, you want to wrap us up? And thank you, Nicole, for the advice. Anyone else wants to chime in there?
Yes, please do add the advice. So yes, well, there's never enough time with just an hour, but I wanted to thank all our discussants and those of you participating, and just know this was a great conversation, and I'm sure it'll be listened to by quite a few other folks who weren't able to make it today. So just wanted to say thanks again, and looking forward to next week's Just an Hour. We have a session that'll bring together faculty from the Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts and Teachers College, talking about how they've engaged in interdisciplinary research and writing collaborations, and sort of the process that brought them together, which I think Punya and Clarin's work was instrumental in getting some of those partnerships started. So looking forward to that. And to the 27th, we've got a panel talking on the interesting topic of back to the future of educational research. This is going to be a session that's also going to be part of something called the Learning Planet. Is it Festival? That's right. Thanks, Clarin. Really interesting. I suggest that you look that up. It's going to be an international festival. Iveta is involved quite a bit with that, and I think we'll hear more about a variety of sessions related to that in the next couple of weeks. So yeah, with that, we're right on time for wrapping up. So thanks again, and hopefully I'll see you all next Friday.